been extremely eye-opening and inspiring. And I realized, for me, it's quite analogous to coming to the summit. I started coming in 2011 to the summit, so it's been a while, but I remember showing up to the summit and it's like, oh, I think I'm a pretty good instructor and I've got this figured out. And just as we've seen the last couple days, the summit really can kind of shake the ground you think you're standing on and challenge you and push you and have you become a better outdoor educator. And the last couple days with Luis did the same thing. Picked him up at the airport and I was like, great, we can talk about 1992, we're the same generation and we can reminisce about the 90s and be in the field. And for Luis, it's Outward Bound and climbing 7 summits, guiding on Everest. I wasn't going to reminisce about that, but I thought that was kind of the train I was on. And then pretty quickly we were talking about his time with the governor in Colorado and essentially have a position created for him 4 years ago as the Outdoor Recreation Industry Director. And if you haven't kept up on that in the news, it's been a pretty impressive position. It's actually migrated to where 15 other states are trying to emulate that position. They've seen what Luis did in Colorado. And not just bringing the Outdoor Retailer Show, if you hadn't caught that in the news, that went to Denver, that was big news. But what it's done to the economy of Colorado. It's opened a lot of eyes. And it got me thinking, just as I was moving off the path of I can reminisce about the 90s, suddenly my wheels are turning. What is that like to be in politics and be an outdoor educator? And just hearing those conversations, it's inspiring, just like our summit is. And then on top of that, Luis has now moved on to a Fortune 250 company, the VF Corp. If you are not familiar, they own North Face and Timberland and JanSport and those type of companies. And they created a position for Luis there, and the Vice President of Government Affairs. So I'm now just thinking on a whole nother level. I'm thinking about politics. I'm thinking about big corporations. Those were things I wasn't connecting with outdoor education. And I'm truly inspired. And here I am coming from Alaska, and I'm trying to figure out how we connect with our senators. And just at dinner last night, Luis is like, oh, I'm getting an award with Senator Murkowski next week, and we're going to have dinner. And, figure out some things to talk about with her. So there's that connection that I didn't really dream possible with outdoor education, and just as the summit for me has kind of raised the level of what's possible as an outdoor educator. Luis, for me, you were doing that in a bigger scale, on a government, on a national scale, and I'm excited to see where that brings you in the next few years, and we're just so pleased to have you on our, so thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody. Before I get started, I just want to share that being an old wilderness instructor and being so very deeply appreciative of the work that you do, season in and season out, I'm honored to have been asked to be here with you tonight. The things that I want to talk to you tonight about are really, I think, at the core of every wilderness educator's journey. I think at our most base level, we try to find a way to connect the stories and the experiences that we have into effective opportunities for learning for the people that we walk this earth with, both on course and off course. And Ashley, you little faker, I thought we were having fun dinners and everything. You were prying me for information for the intro. This man ate a meatloaf the size of my head last night at Cow and Fish. I'm still astounded by that, so congratulations, buddy. And ironically enough, these are the stories that we capture. These are the moments that we share. I've so very much enjoyed the past day or so wandering the halls and hearing you all share your experiences, both of life and students and on and off course. And people often ask me exactly where Ashley ended up in the introduction. How the hell does a wilderness educator get into politics, and how much change do you think you can really provide? And I'm going to start out on a kind of a somber moment, so if you see me stumbling and staggering a little bit tonight, it's because where I live in Colorado, about 4 miles away from my home, there was just a school shooting at a school called Highlands Ranch, a STEM school. And right now, there are high schoolers in the hospital and I have friends who are desperately trying to figure out if one of their kids is in one of those hospitals or not. And so the story I'm going to share with you tonight is on the backside of things like that. On day 200 of being in the field, when you wonder how much impact you've had, you're tired, you're probably a little skinny, half the things you own probably has a little film of mildew on them, and you're wondering at what cost and what level of impact have I had. Tonight, my story, our story, is the one I want to focus on. How do we drive and develop impact for those around us, and how can, if collectively we galvanize those voices together, change the world that we live in? So, in advance, thank you for listening to my story, and I hope you have some fun. Let's see if this actually works. No, maybe not. Well, I'm going to use my fingers then. While I'm known as a mountaineering kid, I actually didn't start out that way. My father is from Ecuador, and my mother is from the Midwest. So I'm one of those rare Latino Midwesterners that you'll meet out there. And my American grandfather owned a sporting goods store, a hook and bullet store, fly fishing and bird hunting. And kind of like the Hallmark story, my grade school was about a quarter mile away from my grandfather's store. So every day I'd walk down to the shop before my folks would get off of work, and I'd spend about 2 hours there at my grandfather's store, not only spending time with my grandfather who ran the shop and my grandmother who was the bookkeeper, but with Uncle Stokely who was the gunsmith, and Uncle Frank who was the fly fishing rod repair person, and Aunt Sadie. None of these were aunts and uncles. Aunt Sadie would also help run the store in merchandising and marketing. And while at its core I was sort of learning what a family business was like, around 4:30 every day, all of these well-dressed heavyweights would come into the shop. And my grandfather had this little back corner set up with leather couches and one of those little mini refrigerators that was stocked to the gills with booze, whiskey, tequila, vodka, et cetera, et cetera. And for those of you that are old enough to remember this, there was a red rotary phone on top of the refrigerator. Everybody remember those? You have to put your finger in, dot, 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 dot. And that phone number would be given out to these heavyweights partners at home, because all of these folks would come and sit down and just start to talk and mix a drink. It was a different era. It was a different time. And when people ask me what my earliest memory of education in the outdoor industry was, I would say, well, it was learning how to make highballs and whiskey sours at my grandfather's store for all of these people that would come visit. And not having a very clear memory of who these people were as I got older, I started to ask my grandfather, who are all these folks that would come to the shop every year? And he would say, well, that was Senator Danforth, Senator Ashcroft, Augie Bush Sr., the family that owned Anheuser-Busch. And these were all the senators and business people from St. Louis. These are the ones that made the economy and the politics in our state spin. Heavy Republican. And the older I got and the more I understood that, and I reflected on the conversations that I heard in that back room, it was not about the left or the right. It was not about policy, unless that policy had to do with conservation and stewardship and protecting places that they loved. So from a really early age, before I could kind of shoot the duck or even hold the shotgun to understand what that was like, I started to figure out that, my place in this process was somewhat unique. And then if you juxtapose that with spending time in Ecuador, did I just do that? Dun, dun, dun. Big money, no whammies. Here we go. Yay, I got it. Look at that, I didn't have to touch anything. For those of you that know this mountain, semi-dormant, active, back to semi-dormant volcano in Ecuador, Cotopaxi. I spent a lot of my high school years as a hut boy on this mountain. So if you've ever been there climbing or spent some time there and you've seen a couple of the hut attendants there, a lot of the mountaineering organizations in Ecuador are run by clubs, and my father's brother was part of a club, and they sort of treat it like a polo club or a soccer club. You get invited to the club and you get to work there, but I was the bottom of the totem pole and low entry-level worker
where I would portage stuff back and forth from the parking lot up to the huts. And so at a high school age, I was lucky enough to start spending a lot of time at altitude with people that I would read about in books, heroes of mine, because a lot of guiding companies from all over the world bring their clients to Ecuador to train before going on to larger mountain ranges all over the world. And, being a really incredible, and being in a really lucky and incredible position in life to have that kind of education with the context of the outdoors from both sides of my family, I truly did feel blessed. As school went on and I was doing the things that everybody was telling me I was supposed to do, I sort of juxtaposed that with every Christmas break back in Ecuador trying to spend time in the mountains, every summer break trying to figure out how to get more time in the hills, all at this point solely focused on technical skill acquisition. I thought that that was the key to moving forward and advancing this career that I so desperately wanted, which was to be a Himalayan guide. That's all I wanted professionally. I got my hands on, at 11 years old, the 1963 September edition of National Geographic that talked about the first American expedition to Everest, and Jim Whittaker, who owned Rainier Mountaineering out in Washington State. And for me, that was the sum of my ambition. All I ever wanted to do was be a professional mountain guide. And as the years went on, and I got to the point where I needed to make a choice, profession, career, or career, hobby, what was I going to do? And my abuelita used to like to say in our family, you have 5 choices of profession: doctor, lawyer, engineer, priest, or politician. So find your path, have fun exploring what you want to do, but you eventually have to end up in one of these 5 places, because that's your responsibility as a Benitez, so no pressure there at all. So the evening where I went home and sat my mom and dad down and explained that at that point I was not going to go to graduate school, but I was going to move to Colorado to work for Outward Bound, you can imagine how that conversation went over. Not so well. And when I showed up at new staff training and I sat down in my very first circle up with students, the first thing that my instructors asked me was how climbing and spending time in the outdoors made me feel. Feelings in the workplace in 1992 were not a normal thing. Talking about what you believe in and what you're passionate about versus what you're technically good at, instantaneously I recognized this magical opportunity of what experiential education could stand for. And don't get me wrong, while I worked for Outward Bound, I spent a lot of years coming up here to Lander, doing cross trainings between Knowles and Outward Bound. I can't count how many woofer refreshers I've done at the Noble or here in town. I've sort of lost track. And I found that to be extraordinary. I found the opportunity to work with students on a deeper impact level versus clients that sometimes I felt like I was dragging around behind me on a rope at altitude, to be this amazing cultural and educational interaction that I didn't even think was possible. And so the challenges that I know you've all felt in the field with students, and how you measure that, and how you define success. And I'm going to keep referencing back to my own story in current day. How you take those things on your journey, and I know we all get evals, we read them, we see them, and every once in a while we're lucky enough to bump into that student or get an email from a student that you've really connected with. But in this day and age, the opportunities to really affect change for the next generation, they're extraordinary. And so I was in this really heady place personally where I was able to split my time between doing a little bit of guiding in Latin America and working for Outward Bound all over the United States, and eventually down in Latin America as well. And bit by bit, as the years went on, I started to get more and more interesting invites to bigger mountain ranges all over the world. Because I grew up speaking Spanish, and I also grew up working in the mountaineering system in Ecuador, slowly but surely the people that were my mentors and my friends asked me to come along and be the junior on some amazing expeditions. Now, if you thought that this was going to be a story about here's Luis and here's a bunch of chest-thumping pictures of guiding the 7 summits, you're wrong. Exactly. And here's why. For the longest time, thinking about impact and how we measure it and what that looks like, all I desperately wanted to do was get to Everest. For most mountaineers, regardless of what you think of that mountain, it's kind of the pinnacle. Even if you don't summit, you just want to go touch it, see it, experience it, and figure out how to get there. I was 27 years old when this amazing man called me. Don't let the monk hat fool you. He is not a monk, but he is a very, very snappy dresser. This is Eric Weinmeier, the only blind person to ever climb Mount Everest. Now, at the time, I was a mid-level outward bound instructor, a junior mountaineering guide, and all of a sudden, here was this guy that couldn't see, that was tired of being told what he was and wasn't capable of, and what he could and couldn't do. And he wanted to be the first blind person to climb Everest. Would I be interested in coming along as a guide? Now, when somebody hands you a brass ring, you don't really think about it all that much. You just say yes, and I did. I said, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I was driving home from lunch with him. A couple of things dawned on me. A, I was 27 years old. B, I had only been to the Himalayas once before this opportunity and massively failed. And C, why was he asking me to do this? And so then I started asking around in my community, and it turns out all the people that he was inviting and were saying yes had never been to the Himalayas before, had never been on Everest. And it turns out the reason why is no professional guide with any decent resume would touch this expedition with a 10-foot pole. As a good friend of mine succinctly put it, you're going to take Eric to Everest, you're going to get him killed, and as the guide that took a blind person to Everest intentionally, where he got killed, who's ever going to want to work with you again? Because you're the guide that intentionally got the blind guy killed. So you're going to kill him, and you're also going to destroy your career. That's just stupid. Why would you agree to do that? And I reflected back in that moment on all the things we try to impart to students. All of those oh shit moments where you're not quite sure how it's going to end up, and finding a way through. This is not just about empowerment. This is about redefining what's possible. So I won't bore you with the details, but we did it. Came back with 10 fingers and 10 toes. And my life took a very bizarre turn at that point. Anybody from Texas in the room? I really don't want to offend you. I apologize 1,000 times. But every fat oil baron from Texas started calling and saying, if you can get that blind feller up Everest, you can sure as hell take me up there. How much money do you want to take me up Everest? You know, when people think of big mountaineering, there's sort of this icky connotation that's personified in this article. How to take big spenders to the top of Mount Everest and back. 33, that was a long time ago. But the ego in you sees this stuff, sees the shot in the catalog, and you go, yep. You know, I so appreciated Carlos's talk earlier today about the perception of who you are and the reality of how that plays into the world. And at this point, it felt pretty good. I was going back to Everest year after year. I eventually got a job as the chief operating officer for Adventure Consultants. So if you've read the book Into Thin Air, or if you've seen the movie Everest, they lost their CEO in 1996 on the summit ridge, Rob Hall. So my job was helping them get back to being a global brand. I was doing the work that I thought I was destined to do and loving every minute of it. I went to Everest 7 times and I was able to summit 6. I've done each one of the 7 summits, depending on how many Kilimanjaro this or Denali that, a total of 32 times. That was my world. It was the world that I had built. It was the world that I had focused on. It was the one that I wanted to stay within. Being in a room like this makes me feel happy and relaxed and comfortable. Because I look out at all of you and I could venture a guess that if we each had a minute alone, we could probably find a shared experience somewhere in our past. And so being in that place and living, as I like to say, the dazzling life of a mountain guide, In 2006, I started doing these silly little things that senior guides do, doing back-to-back 8,000-meter peaks, where you would be on one in the fall and one in the spring with a bunch of other stuff sort of jammed into your year. And as you see from a lot of Instagram feeds that are out there of people on Everest right now that are going to bounce straight to K2, it's pretty commonplace now to be able to figure out from an athletic perspective how you sort of connect those dots and get it done. So I'd been on Everest in the spring, did a summer in Europe, and then bounced to this mountain, Cho Oyu, which is on the border of Tibet and Nepal, the 6th highest mountain in the world. And it was just kind of business as usual. Cho Oyu is really a training peak for those that are looking to go to Everest. And you can see here by the map, it's right on the border between Tibet and Nepal. And the Nang Pala Pass, and the reason why I pointed out on this map, was a low pass at about 18,000 feet that was about 2 miles away from base camp that Tibetan traders would use to go back and forth between Tibet and Nepal to exchange goods that they couldn't find in Tibet. It was also a pass that Tibetan refugees would utilize to cross out of Tibet, cross through Nepal, and get to Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government reside in exile. Now, as a guide, culturally you know all these things. And when you see groups going over the pass, you sort of acknowledge mentally a group of traders, group of refugees. It's almost like, as a friend of mine that lives in McAllen, Texas, living right on our border with Mexico. You see this movement back and forth. And you explain it to your clients, and you try to have cultural sensitivities, and then you just go on about the daily business of climbing an 8,000-meter peak. But one morning at breakfast, as I was sitting in my tent, I heard what outside sounded like firecrackers. And it gave me pause because the Tibetans and the Nepali Sherpas that join us on these expeditions have a deep belief that you do not burn or explode anything on these mountains other than juniper at the puja altars, because if you do, you upset the god or goddess that lives on the summits of these mountains. And as I was kind of turning around to pile out of my tent, our lead climbing Sherpa, our Siddhar, Ang Seding, poked his head inside and said, "Luis, please come outside. Very, very bad soldiers shooting." And as I poked my head outside the tent, I saw all of these Border Patrol soldiers streaming into camp. And as I looked over towards the pass, what I realized was that a group of Border Patrol soldiers had been tipped off that there was a group of refugees trying to get out of Tibet. And instead of trying to catch them because they were at least a quarter mile ahead of them, about a mile away from base camp, knelt down in the snow and started indiscriminately shooting at Tibetan refugees running uphill at 18,000 feet. And as the chaos ensued at base camp and more soldiers came into camp, we realized that the ones that they could catch, the slow ones, were children. Now, being a mountain guide and being responsible for the safety of my clients, if not your students, I turned to them. We were already packed for our summit push, and I said, "Listen, we were heading to Camp 1 already. This is not our deal. By the time we come back down, this is a serious international incident. The world's going to know what's happened. There are 18-year-olds with guns that are looking for refugees that are hiding in our tents. Let's get out of town. Let's head up the mountain. Let's go on our summit push. By the time we come down in a couple days, the world's going to know what's transpired." Now, again, full-time focus on becoming a mountain guide professionally. That's all I ever wanted to do. That and work for a wilderness education program like Outward Bound or Knowles. And as we were walking out of camp and we glanced over towards the pass, we saw these dots in the snow that had fallen down and for sure weren't getting up. And I realized then and there that those were Tibetan refugees that had just been gunned down literally a mile away from where we were, in front of a base camp full of 200 international climbers. I remember going to Camp 1 that night and sitting down, shaking my head and wondering about our humanity, our place in the world, and what had just transpired. Needless to say, none of our clients felt like going for the top was worth it. 2 made it, the rest didn't. And as we came back down 3 days later, I started asking the other expedition leaders, what's the world saying? What are they talking about? What happened? What's the information? What's been said? And to a person, they said, Luis, we didn't call it in. We're not going to call CNN or anybody else. That's not our issue. We're guests in this country. If we do this, we'll lose our permits. We'll lose our access to Tibet. We employ Tibetans. So for the safety of our clients and the safety of our business, we've all chosen to stay quiet. Now, do any of you have, and this is going to seem like a big left turn, those awkward pictures of you as a baby in a bathtub with your neighbor's kid, both naked? Your mom and dad have them, and you hope they never see the light of day? This is a moment of vulnerability. Does anybody want to share that those pictures exist? Proudly, look at that. I was in base camp filled with rage that nobody had said anything about this and not knowing what to do. And it turns out my awkward bathtub pictures are with my friend Eric, who at that point was a senior editor for Reuters news agency in New York. And I got on the satellite phone to Eric and I said, buddy, listen, here's the deal. I'm going to write a story and you're going to have to put it on the internet and you're not going to be able to fact check it. I'm still in Tibet. This is still going on. Nobody wants to talk about it. I've got video footage, I've got pictures, and you are just going to have to trust me. I like to tell people that because of those awkward bathtub pictures, he chose to put it on the internet. And when I hung up the phone and I saw via the satellite phone that the article went live, I started hearing all these very impassioned footsteps down to my base camp. And it was all the expedition leaders that showed up to tell me what kind of risk I was bringing down on everybody's head. Where did I get off thinking that I had the authority to put their clients in jeopardy, their company in jeopardy, my own company in jeopardy, everybody's safety at odds with my anger-fueled decision to try to make the world a better place and more transparent? The rumors started flying that this was a prostitution ring, and they were smuggling girls out of Tibet to sell them in Kathmandu and Nepal. There were all these things that were happening, and I won't go into detail about the whole escape from Tibet story where I had to separate from my clients, go out on my own, because it turns out that some of these expedition leaders that I really considered to be friends had given my name to the Chinese authorities in base camp, saying that that's the guy that wrote the story. When I got back to Kathmandu, this was a time when the Maoist insurgency had taken political control of the government because the royal family had recently been murdered. And they were burning tires outside of the Tibetan Refugee Center, demanding that the refugees that had survived and made it to the center in Kathmandu be returned. Mountain guide, outward bound instructor, nothing to do with human rights. I sat in my hotel room deeply conflicted about everything that was going on around me, not understanding why I chose to open my mouth other than just being angry at keeping it quiet. And right at that point, the phone rang, and it was this woman from Washington, D.C. To this day, how the hell she found me, I have no idea. It was Kate Saunders, the director of the International Campaign for Tibet. She said, "Hi, Luis. My name's Kate. Don't hang up. We were wondering if you'd like to meet the surviving refugees who are at the refugee center, who are under police protection, and we're going to fly to India tomorrow because we've been hearing that there are rumors of it being a prostitution ring. Would you be interested in coming to meet these refugees?" And I said, absolutely, because I'm not going to be able to rest unless I understand fully what happened. And I got to the refugee center, and I met with these children that were being sent to Dharamsala by their parents for a Tibetan education, an education that they were not able to receive in Tibet under the current political structure. And at the time that I arrived, they were just getting word that the people that did not survive were two 18-year-old nuns that were gunned down and left on the pass. So I wish I could tell you that life got a lot more purpose-driven from there and it got easier. I wish I could tell you that the choices I made from that point to this were so clear and so directive, you're probably thinking in your head, oh, well, okay, so that's how we got into government. Purpose-driven, mission-driven. I get it. But that's not the story. Because I had built my entire life towards guiding, I went back to work. My boss said, I get it. It's bad. It's awful what happened, but you can't make this kind of noise and work for us because in that community, all the companies are connected. I still wanted to work on Everest. I still wanted to guide. I was doing what I loved. I wanted to be the old, crotchety, retired guide / instructor, giving all the good jobs to all the up-and-comers. That's what I wanted my life to be. And in 2008, I was getting ready for what would be my last expedition on Everest. And you guys know what packing is like in the Gulch, and I'm sure you've done this in your garages, packing for expeditions. You know, when you pack for Everest or an 8,000-meter peak, you hire 5 friends, you go to Costco 15 times, your garage in your house looks like a train wreck. For my friends, it was a lot of thrasher metal and Metallica and Megadeth playing really loudly in the background. And the phone rings. And I pick it up, and I can barely hear over the awful music as people are counting Snickers into Ziplocs and filling 30 duffel bags laid out on the floor. And I say hello, and this gentleman on the other end says, hello, Mr. Benitez. My name is Lodi Gary. I'm the Dalai Lama's special envoy in Washington, D.C. His Holiness has heard about the work that you've done on behalf of the Tibetan people, and he would like to meet you. Now, the part of the story I didn't tell you was that on the down low, while guiding, to soothe my conscience, I started working for the International Campaign for Tibet on the back end, helping to rewrite policy, understand the movement of refugees all over the world, and how Dharamsala takes its place in that process. And I was reflecting, well, that's probably the work that he heard about, but I was so distracted about people screaming like 15 bags of ramen. No, we need 18 in that duffel. Like, hello, yes, Mr. Gary, thank you so much. I'm so honored. Please tell His Holiness I'm getting ready for an Everest expedition. If he's in Dharamsala in June when I'm done, I'd be more than happy to stop by. Thank you very much for calling. Goodbye. Click. So, yeah. I'm literally sitting there with my hand still on the phone. I remember this as clear as day. And I'm kind of looking at my hand and I'm looking at the phone. And 2 of my friends who know me really well came over like, what's going on? Like that was, and I explained who it was. And their eyes got really big and like, oh my God, what did you say? And I'm still holding the phone. I'm like, I said no. Oh my God, I said no. Like, you idiot, call like star 69, call them back, figure out, like, what do you do? How do you fix it? And right as I'm picking up the phone, getting ready to dial star 69, I actually had 2 lines in the house at this point because people call from different parts of the world on expeditions at weird hours, as you know. And the other phone rings. And it's Kate Saunders, the director of the International Campaign for Tibet, laughing. And she says, okay, Luis, pop quiz. When the Dalai Lama's special envoy calls you and says that His Holiness wants to meet you, what do you say? You say yes. I backpedaled. I said yes, thinking that, like with most dignitaries, it was going to be a 30-second handshake meet and greet, and I was going to be ushered through the room in Dharamsala, and that was going to be it. It was an honor. It was an incredible honor. But being a part-time Buddhist as a mountain guide, I thought that, this is very special, but I know I'm no bigger than anybody else that does work on behalf of the Tibetan people day in and day out. Through a scheduling fluke and a couple of people having to cancel, it was the Dalai Lama, his interpreter, 2 secretaries, 3 people from the International Campaign for Tibet, and myself in a room for 50 minutes talking about culture and community. So let me explain how much my ego was still in control of my life at this point. I had the audacity to sit in front of this man and lament the loss of my career. Your Holiness, thank you for I'm very appreciative that you recognize the work I've been trying to do. This has been really hard. I've lost guiding jobs. I've lost friends for speaking out. I'm really conflicted how to continue through this. I'm just not sure what to do. I had no idea how he was going to respond, but he responded in the most perfect way. He laughed until I thought he was going to wet his pants. Had to wipe his eyes, patted me on the knee, and he said in broken English with a couple of words from his interpreter, "Yeah, Luis, I'd love to be my people's spiritual and temporal leader and still live in the Patala Palace in Tibet, but instead I'm a refugee with a government in exile in a different country, so sorry, kid, you can't always get what you want." And still gives me goosebumps. And at that point, I laughed too, because you have to, right? You can't see that face and not laugh. He looked me square in the eye, and he said, Luis, sometimes your path, sometimes you don't choose it. Sometimes it chooses you. And now, you're going to have to make the decision how you want to show up. But before you leave, I want you to experience Dharamsala. I want you to see our parliament and how our government works here in exile. And I want you to meet the other kids that actually made it here, because they're in school right now, here for what they wanted to get in the first place. And Dharamsala is everything you think it is. It's this amazing culture where people speak 12 languages. I mean, I'm not kidding. 12 languages, and this center of art and science and culture and education. And it gives you hope of everything a government and a country could be if left to their own devices. And spending time with the children that had made it all the way there and hearing about their new life and what they were doing and how they were thriving. And then meeting the even younger children who were encouraged through art to process the trauma that they had been through, to understand how welcome they were. We were sharing pictures that I had shared with the news and that I had broken to other storied outlets, and the girls would all ask me, "Well, what do you do now?" And I said, "Well, I'm still a mountain guide." He said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, it's what I love to do." And then they would go on, "Well, I want to be a nurse, and I want to be a journalist." And all of these amazing dreams from kids that a couple years earlier would never have been possible. My last day in Dharamsala, I got to sit in the back of their classroom as they learned English. And I got to watch these kids evolve into what they hoped was going to be something that they could never have dreamed possible before. And right about the time where I thought I understood it, again, referencing Carlos, okay, I get it, I get the story, this is the way the world should work, this gives me great hope. My guides, the people that were watching over me on this journey said, come, you have to see the Dalai Lama's audience before you leave tomorrow. We have one coming up tonight. And I asked what that was, and they said, well, every refugee that makes it to Dharamsala actually gets to sit in audience with His Holiness. So it's usually in groups of 100 to 200 people. Imagine sitting in a room like this with your living God showing up and sitting down on the stage, and you've risked your entire life and everything that you are and left your family to be there. It is an emotional moment. I thought, oh, absolutely, I'd love to see this. But what he said in that audience is what changed the direction of travel for my life. He sat down, and the interpreter was sort of speaking in my ear, explaining what he was saying, said a few prayers for opening, and then he launched into a dialogue that I'm sure he'd given hundreds of times. He said, if you are a political refugee and your life is in danger back home, you have a home here, you have a job here, you have an education here for the rest of your life. You are safe, and you are welcome to stay here forever. I thought, that's amazing. What a validating thing to hear after something like that. But then he said, if you are not in danger, I want you to get what you came here for. I want you to get the fullest extent of what you hope to become here with us. And when you feel like you've reached that place of fulfillment, I want you to go right back to where you came from and share it with the people around you. Can you imagine going through something like that, sitting down for the first time after getting a shower and a meal and being told, get what you want, and then go right back over the pass to where you came from and share it with others? I flew home after doing Everest, and I quit. I quit Adventure Consultants. I went back to working for Outward Bound Professional for a little while, which is like your custom program. I collaborated on every book and every article I could, talking about the Tibetans and human rights internationally, how that makes the world move both socially and politically. And to this day, when people wonder, how did the wilderness instructor / mountain guide get into politics and get into talking about why these things are so important, this is not a story that I usually tell. This is not one that I feel comfortable telling, except in a room of friends like you. And when I look at the next generation coming up, and I see that audacity of hope, and I see the potential that they have, and then I juxtapose that with the deeply troubling times that we are in right now, I wonder where their inspiration will come from. I wonder how they will define grit. I wonder how they will shape tenacity. I wonder how they're going to be in a place to understand that they are more capable than they ever thought possible. And the answer I keep coming back to is the work that you do every single day. We've gotten really, really good at pointing the finger at somebody else. It's somebody else's problem. It's somebody else's job. It's not my fault. This doesn't involve me. But I want to drop some other things on you before I end. This is how big our economy is in the United States. And if you can't get your head around $887 billion, that's larger than the auto and the pharmaceutical industry in the United States combined. Now, I want you to think about that from a political power perspective. What conversation do we have? Being responsible for over 7 million American jobs, how do we show up in that conversation? From human rights all the way on down. How? Primarily, this is how. Service projects. Sweat equity. Trying to preserve the things that drive that economic engine through stone-cold labor. Where's the strategy in that? Where's the planning in that? Where's our collective voice in that? You know, in the past couple years, I've really started to think about, and this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusivity, how we shape the narrative. And for a lot of people of color, this has to do with representation. And I would argue there's another level to that dialogue. And for us, it's who are the people that you put out in front of that narrative? What is their story? And do they believe what you believe regardless of their history? To be pointed in the direction of preserving not only that economy, but providing guidance to how it can be the beacon on the hill. So these are two friends in Colorado that we put out there a lot. Chela Garcia, who helped start Latino Outdoors, and Chad Jukes was the first Iraqi veteran amputee to summit Everest a couple years ago. How do you shift that narrative? Because the way we recreate, the definitions are changing fast. So I share this with you, not because the definitions of mountain biking have gone way off the rails. I don't know how many of you like high-angle vert pump tracks, but that to me is just an accident waiting to happen. And you know, when people complain about no marketing budgets, this is a bluegrass band some buddies of mine in Eagle, Colorado, a town of 7,500 people, they have "Wish You Were Here" on a piece of cardboard that they put out in front of their stage, and they're right next to a river takeout where all the guide trips come out, grab a beer, listen to some music. Their Instagram feed is off the charts from this piece of cardboard saying, "Wish you were here. Wish you could experience what I am." And these little Thundercats in the upper right-hand corner are how I'm going to define this point and really drive it home. How many of you out there learned how to paddle in an old aluminum Grumman canoe? Anybody? Proud, that's right. You know, you get that black aluminum on your butt and on your hands, and if the canoe is in the sunshine, even though it's like 60 degrees outside, when you sit down, it's 150 degrees, and you always get that burn right below your shorts. That is historical baggage. That's our definition of how we recreate. And I walked up to these kids with that baggage firmly implanted in my head, and like, "Oh, you guys, your first paddling course, oh, that's so cute. Where are your canoes?" I swear to God, this little kid with the yellow hat turned on backwards looked me square in the face and said, "Canoes like the Native Americans use at Thanksgiving?" I'm not kidding. He said Native Americans, and he said Thanksgiving. And this little girl to the left said, yeah, they used animal skins, they dried them out, and they stretched them over the frame, and they sewed them together. And then another kid said, "Yeah, and they painted symbols on the outside." They were literally telling this story of skin-walled canoes. I'm like, "No, your canoe." And they're like, "We're not, no canoes." And the kid with the yellow hat on said, "My mommy and daddy sup. And I am here to learn how to stand up paddleboard." If I would have told you 5 years ago, without any swiftwater rescue training and $500 in your pocket, you could go to Costco or Sam's Club, buy an inflatable surfboard and a paddle, and go toddle down any waterway on the planet that you wanted to, you probably would have looked at me and told me I was nuts. Yet here's this burgeoning, multi-billion-dollar economy that has no ethical compass yet. Now, you may think the pros only do this, right? Like, this is the brosif, isn't he cool? Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody shows up. Okay, another moment of vulnerability. Who here has done stand-up paddleboard yoga? Where you can get hurt and wet all at the same time. How will leadership be defined in these modalities of recreation? And why are they just considered modalities of recreation? Why aren't these considered political, galvanized forces to defend our waterways, to protect our ecosystems, to drive that economic engine, and to serve as leadership and inspiration for how we interact as human beings and as a community? That's strategy. So when Ashley referenced all these other states that are creating these offices, this map's actually out of date. There are 15 states that are creating offices of outdoor recreation industry underneath their governors, focused on 4 swim lanes: economic development, conservation and stewardship, education and workforce training, and public health and wellness. By July, these states' coalition will be seated under the National Governors Association, which is the governing body that all the governors of every state get together 3 times a year to discuss policy and process. Not bad for a couple of outdoor kids, huh? What will your place in that conversation be? Will you inspire a student to be a part of that process? As I begin to land the plane tonight, this half of the room is thinking, "That guy's nuts." Now he's showing pictures of guys with rakes and hot dogs. The other half of the room is thinking, "Before I go car camping with my buddies, I got to get the rake out of the garage and clean it off, because that is genius." I remember this night very, very well. Classic junk show weekend rock climbing trip. Everybody decides 5 p.m. on a Friday, let's go, throw everything in the car, go. Get to the campground, no stoves, no fuel, fire ring. Nobody had, nobody even had a, I think we used flint to actually get somebody had a fire starter kit to get the fire going. We had food, we had big coolers of food and beer and beverages. And I'm lamenting, I'm like, how are we gonna do this? Oh my God, we're gonna starve, we gotta drive into town. Okay, there's a Walmart, we can get Coleman fuel, we can just buy a cheap 2-burner. All this big strategy. And Dougie here walks over to his truck, gets a wet wipe out and kind of wipes off the tongs on the rake, sticks all the hot dogs on, and Bob's your uncle. Now, I say this tongue in cheek, but this is what we bring to the world. The recognition in this room for this is so satisfying because in other talks that I give in DC and other places are like, explain to me the philosophy behind the rake and how does that connect? But all you guys are like, yes, that's it. That's the magic that you bring to the world. So I'll share the bigger world context of this with you as we wrap up here. Steve Jobs for Apple, regardless of what you think of him as a human being, because there are a lot of stories out there that consider him awful, and there are a lot of stories out there that consider him a mad genius. In the context of his company, he would sit new people down in a room like this and he'd say, congratulations, you got a job at Apple. I'm sure you're probably feeling very, very good about yourself, so everybody, big pat on the back. And I'm sure you're probably thinking that the person to your left and the person to your right is smarter than you, and you're just lucky to be here. And you're gonna keep your mouth shut, head down, do your work, earn your paycheck, get the benefits, and that's gonna be enough. If that's enough for you, there's the door. Because here, we want those crazy ideas that you have brought to the table. We want you to think about them out loud, push on them, experiment here. Because the idea that everybody around you is calling crazy today, 10 years from now, they're gonna call it genius. My biggest argument with things like this that we do that seem just kind of fun to us, the rest of the world looks at that stuff and goes, oh my God, that's exactly what we need right now. And let me be the first person to tell you that that is exactly what we need right now. I have been lucky enough to climb, travel, and work all over the world. I have met extraordinary people that have put their lives on the line for me in dramatic fashion. And I also have really great friends that know how to make a perfect cup of tea and sit down at sunset and just have those amazing conversations. I am a keeper of all of those stories. I inherited that history through my life and through my shared experiences with them. And it would be easy for me to sit back and say, my fulfilled life and the images and the stories I have in my head are enough. I impact my community, I impact my friends, and that's good enough. But the last and I think most important story I'll share with you tonight has to do with this guy. This is Ang Sitting. He had been with me on every Himalayan trip I had ever done, right up until the time he got killed in that big avalanche earthquake that happened on Everest a few years ago. But after every trip, I was always incredibly excited to go down to his village, Kumjong, and talk to this guy, his dad. I know he looks to be about 180 years old. Sherpa families sometimes don't keep birth records or birth history, so he's not quite sure how old he is. But every conversation after we got a little bit of ducha, milk tea out, and we're sitting in the sun, pretty much went like this. I was always really excited to tell him, with Ang Sitting translating, how proud I was of his son, how happy I was to work with him year after year, all the success we had, failure, triumph, tragedy, whatever had happened on that trip, I wanted to share it with him so he understood how important the relationship with his son was to me. And he'd say to me pretty much the exact same thing that I'm going to end tonight with you. He'd look at me He'd wave a craggly finger at me and he'd say, Lulu. That's my nickname in Nepal. It sounds like you brought a bunch of white people and money to my country again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The dude is a capitalist at heart. And he'd say, did they stay at my tea house? How many days? Did they eat? Did they drink? Okay, all right, good, good, good. But then he would ask the question that I think is in front of all of us now. He said, what is it that you do on your expeditions that makes my grandchildren's world better? What is it that you do every single day that will make their world, and the word really doesn't translate, more extraordinary? And this is a ubiquitous global question. Sherpa kids are the same as our kids. The generational challenges, while maybe different, are equal. And maybe, just maybe, if you're willing to lean in hard enough, we can impact what happens on the other side of that conversation. Thank you for listening. Thanks, you guys. Thank you. Oh. Thank you. I know it's late. It's 8:15, and if you're like me, it's time to go to bed or go have tequila. I'm not one of the two. But I was asked if I would stick around for a couple of questions, and so what I'd like to do to be respectful of people's evening and time is maybe answer a couple and then hang out over here on the side of the stage, and if y'all want to hang out and talk or decamp to town, my flight is until 7:30 tomorrow morning. Is that good, Liz? Are we good? Is that okay? And if there are no questions, good night, we're done. Anybody? Yes?
In addition to...
Oh, a runnable microphone. Oh boy. Check.
In addition to positively influencing our students' lives and the future of the world, what are other ways that you see that we could get involved with these conversations in a political world?
You have a state director here. His name is Dominic Bravo. He's an incredible individual. Call him, write him, email him. If you're from Montana, Rachel Vandenvoort, she's an amazing director as well. You know, I've come to this place, we tend to teach students environmental policy and some of these other things, but when it comes to understanding, you know, I go back to that TV show Electric Company when I was a kid, how a bill is made. Any old schoolers out there remember that? Conjunction junction, what's your function? Schoolhouse rocks, that's it, thank you. Thank you. We don't teach that. Civics isn't taught anymore. And so I would argue if you've got time at a circle up in the field, in town, civics, bipartisan civics, that's important. We need to talk about how the hunting and fishing and motorized community pays for a majority of the conservation and stewardship that goes on in the United States right now. They pay into the system. We show up with volunteer trail projects and sweat equity. What does that look like in the future for a pay-to-play system? How will gear companies pay into help that infrastructure? Because no magic bucket of money is going to fall from the sky. Educating students about some of these challenges. I said out loud about 2 months ago that the Forest Service needs to be removed from the Department of Agriculture and put into the Department of Interior because it's no longer a timber company. I think I had a contract put out on my life from federal workers that I got some hate mail off of that one. But we have to be brave enough to have that conversation. And for a kid from the city, like, why would Forest Service, like, don't they hug trees? What do they do? We take those conversations to a certain level, but now we need to start talking about policy and politics a little bit and having some of those difficult conversations. I don't want to influence curriculum or pedagogy right now. You got to do what you got to do. But that's where I see influence happening right now because schools aren't doing it. They're just not. Thanks. Good question. Anybody else? People are getting sleepy. Oh, one more and then that's good. Perfect symmetry. 2, and then break.
Can you talk about, I grew up in Wisconsin and remember the Republican folks around where I grew up being environmentalism and stuff, which, at least at a national level, to my understanding, is not the case anymore. But it sounds like you have some probably better insight into maybe what those interests are in, maybe you can speak to both major parties, like what are the interests and values
Great question.
in conservation and environmentalism that are bipartisan right now?
At being an old wilderness instructor, I kind of showed up the way I think we're all inclined to. Protect this watershed, look at this ecosystem, this mountain range. These are valuable natural resources. You have to, right? To politicos. When our economy started getting counted and our jobs started getting added, we flipped the conversation to show up and talk to electeds saying, in your state, here's how much happens in consumer spending in the billions. Here's how many hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs this economy is responsible for. And so tell me, how are you going to protect that part of your economy and all of those jobs? I haven't met a politician yet that looks at that answer and goes, oh, that's not important. And so you combine that conservation and stewardship with telling the story about the economy. For us in the past, that's been the acceleration of the last 5 years. 5 years ago, there were 2 states with an outdoor industry office, Utah and Colorado, Republican and Democrat. Now there's going to be 15 by the fall. Our entire shape for everything that we talk about is the size of our economy. And other people are paying attention, so I'll end there. So it's one thing to talk about the size of our economy, and you referenced it as Republican and Democrat. It's another thing to show up with a collective voice pointed in the same direction, because you've got the mountain bikers and the dirt bikers, don't get along. You've got the hikers and the hunters, not necessarily getting along. You've got fly fishing folks and boaters and suppers, not necessarily getting along. Our economy is better than yours, we do more, you do less. Until we get to that point of clarity, pointed in the same direction, people look at the infighting and go, see? They don't have it figured out yet. I will always reflect back on the size of our pocketbook. That is so serious in the context of political leverage. We have not figured out how to galvanize it yet. So when you ask about conservation and stewardship, I will always point to, so case in point, Minnesota, Michigan, Arkansas, believe it or not, and Kansas are the next states in line to create offices of outdoor recreation industry. And you may look at yourself and go, why Arkansas? The Walton family in northwestern Arkansas created an integrated mountain biking trail system to lure Walmart executives to town to live an outdoor lifestyle. Changed the game in terms of community development. Put a lot of Walton money into that, and now Arkansas oh, well, that's a pretty important economy. We should probably focus on that. So you can change the game. One more? Two more. Oh, God. If you guys want to go. Sure.
Those two things seem to be in conflict with each other.
Talk about that a little bit. Can everybody hear that? He said the two things seem to be in conflict with each other.
Yeah, like worrying about the economy, essentially money, and conservation.
Mm-hmm.
They seem in conflict with each other. So to conserve a place and resources, energy, and making money don't work.
You've just hit the nail on the head. Please. Oh, this is good.
How do we be pragmatic,
Mhm.
live in late-stage capitalism,
Mhm.
and how do we transcend? Because as long as the outdoor industry is an extractive industry, just as oil and gas is, then we will continue to extract to make money from it.
It's great.
Yeah.
Solid questions. I was hoping this was going to happen. Thank you. And we can continue this over there. People are like, Jesus, God, please let me go get a drink. So they are in opposition to each other. That point of tension is where people pay attention. And I think I could give you an easy answer and say, well, if we don't take people into the woods and the mountains to show them what they need to conserve, they're just never going to want to pay attention to it or put money or effort towards conserving it. The reality is, and I'll share a couple of examples. People are moving to places where there is an outdoor ecosystem around it to have their cake and eat it too. to be able to eat and go for a bike ride at the end of the day, to be able to go to work and go climbing or boating or do those things. And with a gig economy, with broadband coming to more and more towns and some of those intersections, people can do it. And the light bulb went off for me. Jeff Bezos, regardless of what you think of the dude, and Amazon, back when their HQ2 process was going on across the United States, and everybody was, come on, come here, bring your jobs, bring your money. He wrote this op-ed on LinkedIn. He chose to put it on LinkedIn and no place else. And it was kind of an aha for me. He wrote, "Dear all states that are competing for our second headquarters, thank you very much for trying to win them. We appreciate that, but let me explain a few things to you. One, we got plenty of money, so your incentives don't matter. Sorry, but they don't. Two, I'm way more interested in what you're going to offer in the context of quality of life to my employees." And all of a sudden it hit me. Economic development for regions now, I just explained the Walton principle. People are choosing to utilize a natural resource infrastructure to drive economic development. So if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the table for that conversation. And when I think about who is going to lead that point of tension, to be able to be at the table at a state level with the governor, like state directors are, and to be able to say, you know what, this place should be left alone in perpetuity and be deep wilderness. But the challenge we have, and anybody from France, sorry if anybody's on the streaming thing from France. Anybody from France? Anybody have friends in Chamonix, like partners in Chamonix? Okay, sorry. When I was climbing in Chamonix with a really good buddy of mine who smokes unfiltered Gauloise cigarettes, and they're always hanging out the side of his mouth, I talk about deep wilderness. I talk about the wilderness letter. I talk about our best idea, our legacy, and he usually ends up flicking his cigarette at my head, at a belay ledge that falls and hopefully doesn't start a forest fire. He's like, oh, you Americans, everything to you is deep wilderness. And he spent a lot of time in Boulder. And is Boulder deep wilderness? I go, oh, no. Is Portland deep wilderness? And he went down this list of all these iconic outdoor towns. I'm like, yeah, that's front country wilderness. He's like, do you charge people to go play there? Well, no, because that's our great idea. It's free for Americans. He's like, yeah. Here in Chamonix, everybody pays for everything, and look. You got a helicopter when you need it. You got a telefreak up. You can climb a hard alpine route and be having a cappuccino back in town by the evening. We do not call this deep wilderness. This is an outdoor experience. The evolution of how we define things has been pretty static for a really long time. And I'm not arguing that one thing is better than another, but I am arguing that that tension will not go away. And we're going to have to find a way to speak to both sides of that process. Because if we just stay over here and say, wilderness is wilderness is wilderness, the challenge that we're going to have is this is going to happen to us instead of with us. So the last example I'll give you. How many people have ever ridden an e-bike? Be brave. Come on. They're fun. Everybody know what an e-bike is? Yeah. I've seen somebody, like I've seen it, right? So there's a German company called Hi-Bike that's the largest manufacturer of e-bikes in the world. They've got a t-shirt that translates uphill is the new downhill, and horrifying to me. But I got to get on one once and ride it. And it's not a throttle. You still have to pedal to make it work. Click, 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 click. They're illegal. Well, but the Peloton. But no, I'm talking about out in the wilderness, out in the woods, right? And the mountain bikers, so they're illegal because people consider that an engine, right? So people get stopped on mountain biking trails all the time. That's an e-bike. You can't do it. And I remember I was part of one of those conversations. I stopped the guy and I'm like, listen, respectfully, this trail system does not allow mechanized transport. E-bikes are still considered mechanized transport. Sorry, but you probably shouldn't be on this trail. He reached down, unclicked the battery, put it into his camelback, and biked away. And then he stopped about 10 feet away, turned around, and was like, just so you know, I have the new model of this bike on order, and you can't even see the battery. It's incorporated into the bottom tube of the bike. And I'm just going to put a little piece of duct tape on the light. You're never going to know that I'm riding an e-bike up here. So that point of tension of things being done to us or with us, the e-bikes are coming. People in Europe are like, this is a great thing. Motorcycle folks say, that's a mountain bike. Mountain bike folks say, that's a motorcycle. We're not going to create a third trail system in the United States to facilitate the use of e-bikes. Where does that conversation leave us? So how will we define deep wilderness and the wilderness experience that allows people to capitalize on a new definition for conservation and stewardship? These are not easy questions, and I agree with the both of you, but we're gonna have to stay in that hard spot and keep pushing, because things like that scare me, because then that means it's just happening to us out of control and no strategy. So thank you. Thank you.